Let's do it.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining our panel today. We're excited. It's on Palestine's entrepreneurship ecosystem. My name is Adil Kalam. I'm one of the co-founders of an organization called Silicon Valley Palestine, which is a 501c3 focused on accelerating the development of Palestine's technology ecosystem. What we do is we work on incubating initiatives that are in line with our mission and follow our theory of change, and then help set those up to be independent, sustainable efforts that can promote and develop the broader ecosystem. Before I get into that, I'd like to just welcome our panelists, introduce them. Two of them who I've worked closely with, and one who's going to provide us a perspective closer to the ground. And that's Marwan Abdelhamid. He is a student at the University of Santa Barbara. He's Palestinian from Jerusalem and grew up in Gaza. He has started a company, a startup known as GrowHome. He's the founder of GrowHome, which connects diaspora Palestinians to entrepreneurs in their home countries. He's also a musical artist and hosts the Palestine Excellence podcast, and a content creator with already over 80,000 followers, and is part of a new generation that is excited to do big things. Next, we have Iliana Montauk, who is the co-founder and CEO of Manara. She, prior to that, was a senior product manager at Upwork, which is the world's largest talent marketplace. She managed the talent side of the marketplace and launched a solution to vet engineers at scale. Before that, when we met, Iliana was the co-founder and director of Gaza Sky Geeks, which is an initiative that was launched in 2011 with Mercy Corps in partnership with Google.org. GSG, Gaza Sky Geeks, became one of the top startup hubs in the emerging market, which facilitated the first investments into Gazan startups in Palestine. She's had a focus on women and participation and getting that up to always over half, and then ran the largest crowdfunding campaign in the Arab world and pulled people in from the technology industry to support that. She's originally from Poland and Berkeley, California, and started her career at Google. She's also one of the co-founders of SVP Palestine with me, and will be exciting to talk about that journey and getting it to where it is today. And then lastly, we're really thrilled to have Seth Levine with us. He is one of the founding partners of Foundry Group, which is a venture capital fund based in Boulder, Colorado. He started his career in venture nearly 20 years ago at Mobius Venture Capital. Seth is involved in many efforts, and I think the way to best describe what he's involved in outside of his tech investing is his focus on funds in emerging developing markets, one of which was investing in a Palestinian venture fund called Sadara many years ago. Additionally, he's involved with other funds in MENA and is a founder of Pledge 1%. He is a former board member of the Unreasonable Institute, amongst a host of other institutions, and a trustee of Macalester College. And perhaps most importantly right now, he has just written a book, which will be coming out on the topic of diversity and involvement from that perspective. And so we're really excited to have him with us and hear from him. And I have to also add that he is on the board of advisors for Silicon Valley Palestine. And so we're thrilled to really get into this conversation. I think to kick it off, I wanted to start with just a little bit of context on the development of the ecosystem from our perspective, our meaning Silicon Valley Palestine, is sort of framed this discussion, and would like to take it in the direction of what lessons have been learned, what people have seen, and what can be replicated in other places in the MENA geography more broadly. And our drive, a lot of it was really to connect people using technology more or less to the nexus of the technology industry. So large companies, startups, what's happening in Silicon Valley, what's happening in Boulder, and then really focus on the development of talent and getting exposure and then getting all the right pieces in place. I think as a starting point, Iliana, your journey, which has been a long one, many years now, and you just wrapped up at Y Combinator with Manara. Before getting into that part too much, I'd love to just hear about, and for the audience to hear your path from Gaza Sky Geeks stumbling into that and how you've gone from that place many years ago to where you are now.
Sure. So, and for background, maybe sharing a little bit about how I got into the Palestinian entrepreneurship ecosystem in the first place, since it was not necessarily something that I woke up or left college dreaming to go work in. So I studied Arabic in college, and it was actually a Fulbright that got me back into the region in my career, because after college, I worked at Google and I worked in nonprofits in the United States, and I wasn't really sure how to bring that all together. With a Fulbright, I ended up back in the region and saw very quickly how much the ecosystem was growing in the region, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Dubai, elsewhere. I was working for WAMDA, and I was working on the kind of article side of WAMDA. And it ended up being the former leader of Gaza Sky Geeks who asked me to come to Gaza to see through the last months of this Google.org grant. And I think Google deserves a lot of recognition for their early time in growing the ecosystem in Palestine, and organizations like Mercy Corps as well. So back in the day, when there was no funding from investors, it was organizations like Mercy Corps and others giving grants as a way to get startups off the ground, like 25K grants. So anyways, I'm happy to talk more about what that time in Gaza was like. But to get back to your question, when I came back from Gaza to the United States, it seemed to me like things were picking up, but there was still a lot more space to accelerate the growth of that ecosystem. There was a lot more potential. And what I had seen was working really well was when networks and funding and thought leadership from Silicon Valley or from the global tech ecosystem was partnering with people who really understood what was going on the ground really well, and kind of bringing those two strengths together. And so it was that which inspired me to try to create an umbrella to make more of that happen, because it was already kind of happening organically, but people didn't necessarily know each other or have the partnerships necessary to come together. And so that's what inspired the launch of Silicon Valley Palestine today. And it was in that umbrella of Silicon Valley Palestine that we started having conversations about where is the ecosystem today and what piece is missing. And the part that I got most interested in looking at it back in Silicon Valley at the time, I was working for Upwork. Upwork was the largest talent marketplace in the world. We ourselves could hire engineers from anywhere. I saw these incredible remote jobs that were very high quality. And I saw that on the ground in Palestine, there was a lack of really great software engineering roles. And so people were graduating from college and going straight into working on startups, which is great. And Marwan, I'm sure, is doing an excellent job. And so, Facebook got launched that way. A lot of people go straight from college and launch great startups. And there's a role for people to play who are more experienced, who've built things at scale before. And so that's what inspired the launch of Manara.
I want to, in a bit, get a little bit deeper into that transition, particularly in the sense of how you worked on it while working, at Upwork full time, and sort of what it took to take that off the ground. But before we go into that, Seth, would like to ask you to just maybe take it a level up. Iliana said ages ago was less than 10 years ago when Mercy Corps launched GSG, but it was also around the time that Sadara launched, and so you've been around this for a decade now. And have sort of the unique lens of seeing, a mature ecosystem in Boulder, and being really close to that. But what are the elements that you've seen be critical pieces for actually enabling this sort of development? One, and then in the Palestinian context, was there anything that sort of struck you as unique and different from other places that you've seen?
Well, let me start with the last question, because I think what strikes most Americans as unique is that there is this great potential technology ecosystem in Palestine. I think people just don't understand it, which is really, I think, the source of frustration. Certainly is a source of frustration for me. I got involved with Sadara, I think it's been probably longer than 10. It's probably been 12 or 13 years. I was introduced to the two founding partners of Sadara through a mutual friend. And I've long had this belief in the power of entrepreneurship to lift people up and to lift communities up. I've watched it happen in sort of in a different context in the United States, and I've tried to support with my time, energy, and dollars that idea sort of around the globe in a couple different emerging markets that I personally care about. And when I was approached by this mutual friend, said, "Hey, you should really meet Syed Nassif and understand what he's thinking about with his partner Yadin Kaufman." It was Syed is a Palestinian Arab Israeli, and Yadin is a Jewish Israeli. And they had partnered up with this idea. And I thought, well, that sounds like the kind of thing I could get interested in, right? I mean, there's this tech ecosystem in Israel, which is fine, but it wasn't particularly interesting to me. And so I ended up spending a bunch of time with them. I've now obviously been out to spend time in Palestine and work directly with Palestinian founders. And what you see in Palestine, in Ramallah, in Gaza, are all of the elements that you'd expect to see in a great startup community. My business partner at Foundry, who my venture firm that I helped start now 10 or 12 years ago, Brad Feld wrote a book about startup communities, and we talk, and it's really based on sort of our collective experience working with nascent startup communities, mostly in the US. The book was about startup communities in the US, but the lessons apply globally. And I think we see those elements in Palestine, but I think maybe this is an interesting time to think about how can we, as a community that cares about this, this place, how can we do a better job of fostering entrepreneurship? And there's a couple of things that I just would point to that are basic tenets of entrepreneur communities, as at least as we have seen and experienced it through our lens. We tend to like to take the long view. We think about 20-year arcs in terms of startup communities. Doesn't mean that things don't happen in that arc, and it's not that you have to do all this work and then all of a sudden 20 years later you have a startup community, but it takes a long time, and that's okay. We think about many leaders rather than a single leader. These networks are not hub and spoke. They're much more mesh networks. And we like to think about a lot of tent poles, as we call them, but we're building a tent that has lots of tent poles, lots of people supporting it up. I think that's really important. And then something I'm interested to hear Marwan's thoughts about that is unique to Palestine is this connection between diaspora Palestinians, and there are more diaspora Palestinians than there are Palestinians in Palestine, and those Palestinians living on the ground. And actually what you see in Palestine, many of the institutions have deep roots to either founders that came back and had either lived or worked elsewhere and then came back because they wanted to raise their families in Palestine, or have some other deep connection to places outside of the region. And I actually think that's important, and that's something that we can, I think, really kind of pull on. And then the last thing, which we don't usually talk about in terms of startup communities, but I think is interesting to think about, it's a little bit pulling on the Israeli model, is the role that sort of the central government can play in helping foster and invest in startup structures. And it's not that doesn't happen at all in the US, but the US has sort of evolved now past that. But that's absolutely what we saw happen in Israel and other startup markets, by the way, in certain countries in Africa and things like that. Government isn't the answer, but can play an important role in helping foster the ecosystem, starting with, for example, the educational system. And I know Iliana has a bunch of thoughts on that as well. So I'll pause there, but that's kind of the backdrop.
Yeah, maybe I'll use that as a way to frame a question to Marwan about, so a lot of what we've done obviously has been about connecting the industry to technology, the tech sector in Palestine. What you're doing with your startup is extremely complementary in that, and specifically focused on the diaspora connection. What was sort of the driving force, and what did you see that made this something that you wanted to pursue and a problem you wanted to sort of further?
Amazing. Well, thank you for inviting me and for having the time to hear me out. I think the diaspora problem in Palestine is something that a lot of people talk about. The government has been trying to tackle it for a very long time. And I do think that we can pull on different countries and the way that they've engaged their diaspora for economic development, including Israel, right? Although I don't think the connection would necessarily be fair. But I think, I left Gaza in 2007. I was 7 years old, and I've always identified as a Palestinian living in the diaspora. And, you come here to America, so I'm currently studying in the States, and you see Palestinians everywhere, right? You go to Google, you go to Silicon Valley. I mean, there's Palestinians everywhere. But we're not harnessing the power of this diaspora for the betterment of the emerging entrepreneurial ecosystem, in my opinion. And I think one of the reasons is, a lack of trust in the government, a lack of opportunities, right? And I think back in Palestine, there's all this talent that is not being connected to opportunities and networks. And I think that Iliana and Seth would agree with me that one of the best ways to actually, you know, if a Palestinian wants to create a startup out of college, you need opportunities and you need networks. And for diasporas to get involved, you also need the opportunity to get involved. So what we're doing at GrowHome is we're not asking a Palestinian come mentor this, do that. No, we take really specific skills. So let's say you have a Palestinian working in Silicon Valley that's really, you know, he knows how to fundraise or she knows how to fundraise. We will match that person with a Palestinian entrepreneur living in Ramallah, living in Gaza, that's looking for someone to help them fundraise. So it's a very specific ask, very specific task. Just today, we had a Palestinian entrepreneur by the name of Marwan Alawi, and she needs a design partner in Saudi Arabia for her new SaaS business, right? And she got that through a Palestinian in the diaspora in Saudi Arabia, right? So you make these connections and you start to see people getting excited because they didn't know these opportunities existed before, right? They didn't know that last week the Whole Price Foundation actually invested into a company called Greeners that turns CO2 emissions into fertilizer. They didn't know that they just invested $100,000. They didn't know that there's an incubator called Al Jabal that actually is pumping out local startups left and right, and that there's all these communities. So I think it's really about, number one, showing that there is the talent, but also there is a conversation to be had about culture and the way that that affects the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Because as a Palestinian, you know, there is sort of like, oh, like riyadeh, like entrepreneurship, what does that even mean, right? So yeah.
You're doing a little bit of my job for me by driving this conversation towards, I think, two really interesting directions: talent and networks. I think Iliana and Seth, you're positioned to talk about each of those respectively. So Iliana, maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about Manara, what it's trying to do, and the specific notion about connecting talent and providing opportunities.
So at Manara, we connect the top software engineers, the top computer scientists in the region, starting with Palestine, to their dream jobs. And this came out of seeing that at this point in time, people who are graduating from computer science degrees or computer engineering degrees in Palestine really are competitive with the global market. And the global market wants this talent. The global market is always needing more really high quality engineers. And by that, they don't just mean people who are computer scientists, but also people who have the kind of leadership, collaboration, you know, passion that is just so common in Palestine. I see Ahmed wrote something about entrepreneurship coming in Palestinian blood. And I do agree, there's something about that whole region of the Levant and how entrepreneurial people are. So what we saw at Manara, and the reason we started Manara, is that you have these incredible, you know, world-class college graduates going into a job market that simply can't absorb them. And so there's this internal brain drain happening, where, first of all, a lot of people just don't end up working, period. So more women study computer science in Palestine than men, but 83% of them end up unemployed, which is just, you know, it's almost a tragedy, because you have this talent pool that is ending up without jobs, and there are jobs for them. The global market wants them, but people are not finding each other because they don't realize that it's possible. And because when they do try to apply on their own, their resumes get lost in a black hole. And then if they do make it past the resume screen, they don't know how to do the interviews, because the interviews at these global tech companies, and even at startups, at smaller startups that hire internationally, are very different than what people are used to locally in Palestine. And so what we do at Manara, one of our early participants was somebody who graduated from Palestine, from Bir Zayt, was an excellent software engineer, and ended up in a manual QA role for 3 years. Manual QA means that you're like checking on your phone whether the button clicks, right? This is now she's a data scientist. So that's the kind of potential that we're trying to catch and connect to the right opportunities early on, so that they can accelerate their careers. And when they accelerate their careers, they can then contribute back to the ecosystem. And so we have inspired people and then helped them already get jobs at places like Google. So we've already placed 7 people from Palestine at Google. We actually have a 71% hire rate at Google for the candidates that we refer, which is a signal of how well we understand what the bar is there, and also how well the talent in Palestine actually meets that bar. And we also do the same with remote work. And so we actually just placed a woman in the West Bank in a job 2 weeks ago, where she was earning a very good salary by local standards, $16,000 a year, good for a junior engineer. She's now working at a startup that pays the same salaries around the globe, which is a new trend, and it's accelerating because of COVID. And so she's now going to be working and earning $100,000 a year, going up from $16,000 a year. So this is money that she can now pump into the local economy, but also it's a sign of the kind of career trajectory she's on, the network she's now tapped into. And you can imagine if she just spends a couple of years in that job, what she can then do in terms of coming back and launch. She's already, I mean, she's staying in Palestine, but in terms of being able to then launch her own startup.
I think you're actually underselling some of this. So I want to maybe contextualize it a bit. One, it's what strikes me as really compelling is a few years ago, in the context of Palestinian engineering talent, data science talent, STEM talent overall, I don't think anyone would have conceived that you can go through a few months of a program, get connected with the right people, have the right community, and then you have the optionality to have a job at places like Google or startups, whether it's remote or internationally. It's obviously a big moment for you. You've just completed Y Combinator. You just had demo day yesterday, so thank you for waking up today and making time for this. And as some folks might know already, your round was led by Stripe and their venture fund, and Paul Graham as well, to sort of support this initiative. There's something about community and networks, right? So maybe I'll use this as a way to, Seth, when we came into your orbit, in a sense, although you'd been working on the same topic and had been involved for many years, maybe it was a geography thing, it was just a connection thing, but we hadn't crossed paths. But since then, it's been great to have you sort of involved in the collective effort, and you immediately push for a company that you're involved in, Techstars, to sort of also get involved at that level. What is it about networks and communities that you see as enabling for this sort of initiatives? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're trying to do with the Techstars effort as well.
Yeah, before I do that, I want to just reinforce something you said about Manara, which is this experience that they had in getting into Y Combinator was a huge deal. The experience that Iliana and her co-founder had going through Y Combinator, Paul Graham, this was several weeks ago, saying, "Hey, whatever you do for financing, I want to be involved." Like, that's how passionate he was about it. And then obviously it's a huge deal to have Stripe also in that round, essentially leading the round. So it's a big deal. I just want to put an exclamation point on that, because that's really important.
If I can actually just say something about that. When we applied to Y Combinator as Manara, one of the reasons we did that was because we thought that would be helpful to the region. That getting more startups from the region into the kind of visibility that Y Combinator provides and the networks that provides, that first of all is changing the perspective that people have of the region and what's possible there. And secondly, we then become a channel through which we can make more of these connections. And so yes, Manara, like a part of what we do, a very big part of what we do is our actual solution, which is to take software engineers and prepare them for these interviews at companies like Google on-site or other companies remotely. And a huge part of that is connecting them to networks that help them prepare for these interviews. And we're also building our own network and brand that then can hopefully uplift the whole region. And we could not be more thrilled when we saw Patrick Collison and Paul Graham tweeting about people like Dalia, who went from Gaza to Google, because it's not just about Dalia. When those messages get across, it's really showing everyone that this is the next hub for tech talent. This is not some kind of nonprofit NGO activity.
Somehow we're running out of time really quickly. I do want to follow up on that note and to mention two things. One is I've been really impressed with the formation of a community that's focused on a particular geography that says we're setting out to do this, and then being able to sort of work together, rely on each other for strategic support, funding support, other forms of support to figure all this out. How many iterations did you go through before Manara transitioned from being sort of a nights and weekends project into something you decided to pursue full time?
Sure, and I'm sure Seth and Marwan also have really interesting answers to that. But at Manara, we went through a really good 4 or 5 iterations before we realized that we were at something that was working.
Got it. And then so maybe I'll use that to transition to.
And even now we're still iterating, of course, right? There's pieces that work and pieces where you're improving.
Seth, I don't know if this is the right way to frame it, but do you see this? Maybe we want to talk about what you're trying to do with Techstars and launch, but I almost want to hear about it in the context of, is this an evolution of your initial interest in investments to Dara? What have you learned in that process that's sort of driving force behind what you're trying to do now?
This is how startup communities work, right? And I think everything, I mean, you asked the question about networks, and Iliana just did a great job of punctuating why networks are so important, because she just described literally the network kind of in action, right? I mean, they're sort of living, breathing things. And I think one of the things that we've learned over the years, we talk about Boulder just because Boulder in the US is a great example of this, but there's lots of other markets around the world where this has been true, and tons of markets in the US as well, other markets in the US where this has been true. But this notion of like a group of people coming together in community, at Techstars, we talk a lot about give first, which is this idea of you give before you get, you give without an expectation of getting something in return. And that's an ecosystem, and specifically the entrepreneurs, funders, whoever, lawyers, other people in an ecosystem, helping each other out and supporting each other. And what happens is it just creates a lot more activity in an ecosystem, and things start to happen, right? Serendipity happens. And we're watching it literally in the chat, right? As people are saying, hey, wow, data scientist, I need a data scientist, right? And then that's literally what we're talking about, little microcosm of it. But that's what we need to foster more and more of in Palestine. And I think these are the benefits of having these tentpoles, right? And so now Manara, Iliana, is a tentpole in this ecosystem that's a really important one that's going to drive other people to both be leaders, but also to create this kind of community and help each other out, which is exactly how these kind of startup communities thrive.
And I guess from any of you that Marwan, probably the best perspective on this. Just recently, what's that? We know you're young, but what's that evolution been like to watch in terms of the conversations you've been having, the things that you're involved with, seeing that its maturation as an ecosystem? Even in the past few years, have you noticed any sort of step changes or changes in the way people talk about technology, what young kids are pursuing or interested in doing, and how did these things sort of reverberate across society?
Yeah. So I do think that there is a change in mentality. I think we're waiting for that one success story out of Palestine, right? Just in terms of like the actual entrepreneurial ecosystem. There was Yam Safer that was really close. A startup that's called SimSim Technologies. They're an IoT-based startup. And I have very high hopes for them. They're based out of Haifa. But I think that, once we have that, that success story exits, which I think will happen very soon, then there's going to be a major shift in mindsets. I think a lot of the parents are going to start saying, okay, maybe you can go be like Ahmed Manar, you can go do this instead of being a doctor. Maybe being a doctor is not the pinnacle anymore. Maybe it's actually being an entrepreneur. I think it would be a shame though to, because this panel is called Palestine's Entrepreneurship Ecosystem. I think it would be a shame not to talk about how the Israeli occupation actually affects the ecosystem, because, what I love about Manara is that Gaza, so my home city where I grew up, you can't import or export anything, right? So you have entrepreneurs like Majd Mashharawi that have created things like green cake mix, right? Where they create cement out of rubble and ash, which is insane because you can't import, it's too expensive to import cement. But what I love about Manara is that in Gaza, you can export technology. That's the only thing that the Israeli occupation cannot stop us from exporting is technology. And I really think that, the world already has their eyes on us, but for the wrong reasons. And once there's a solution, once we are actually able to move forward and we're free from the occupation, when we're free from all these shackles that have been holding us back for 70 years, you're going to see a major, major explosion of talent. You're going to see the Palestinian diaspora actually come back. So you were talking about, why are the Palestinians not coming? It's because it's very, very difficult to do business in Palestine. You have on one hand the Israeli occupation, and on the other hand, you have the Palestinian government that's actually, restricting. You have state-owned enterprise, state-controlled enterprise, but you don't have a state. How does that even work? It maybe in the UAE it'll work, but not with, you know what I mean? So I just think there's a lot of restrictions. once we pass them, which it's all political, by the way, I think that we're gonna have just I'm so excited. I am so excited for what comes, but I do think that, you know, a lot of it is political, and it would be a shame not to talk about that, you know, given the context.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought it up, Marwan. And it's important to actually also acknowledge that the occupation throttles the technology innovation as well, right? Because the Israeli occupiers control a lot of the pipes in and out, right? And not to mention just the internet pipes, but also access to you know, telephone technology, you know, wireless, et cetera. And so that actually is an impediment, not to mention just when the power goes out. And you know, there's so many aspects of control that that actually touch even on some of the work that you think of as being totally portable, right? Sitting at your computer and being able to export the talent in your brain. So I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's everywhere, right? You can't spend any time in Palestine without talking about the political situation.
Just real quick, Tawfiq, will it be okay for us to go over a tad to get back the minutes we lost at the beginning to close this out? So otherwise we'd have to wrap up in 2 minutes, which seems abrupt. Yes. Oh, wonderful. We have 5 to 10 minutes. Great. There's through all this, one of the things that pops into my mind, kind of bringing it all together, Gaza networks, giving back, connections, diaspora, is Leila Aboudahi, who's the co-founder of Manara. And I think it actually might be worth just sort of talking through her story as I've seen it and gotten to know her. She became involved in Gaza Sky Geeks, I believe, when Iliana was there, and gone through a program, and then left during the war in 2014, actually by crawling out through tunnels into Egypt to go for her Fulbright in the States in computer engineering, and was in University of Washington. I met her when she had graduated and just moved to Silicon Valley. She came to our first meeting and had just gotten a job at Palo Alto Networks. Eventually went to go work at NVIDIA, but she's Gazan, just been in the States briefly, and had gotten involved in this. And then as she became more and more invested into it, she wanted to essentially provide a solution more or less to her own self a few years ago, and is now, left her job, joined Manara, left to work on Manara full time, and sort of doing that. I just think that's sort of the ideal model, in a sense, where you have someone who is doing all of those things and sort of comes up and goes back full circle. And more of those people, I think, can have massive amounts of impact and step change. And it takes, opportunity, support, structure, and various things, but also, more than anything else, I think initiative and the drive to sort of make it happen. And so for anyone who's, I'm just saying this in the context of anyone who's thinking about what they can do to sort of get involved in a country that's of interest to them, or where they're from, if they're diaspora, what we've learned in the past many years, it mostly comes down to networks, access, perspective, and a lot of sweat, and just trying, iterating, and figuring out how you can best sort of solve this problem. But I'll transition away from that for a second. There's a few questions we have in here. There's two that I think I'll bring up. So one was around whether we can affect the high education curriculum in Palestine, or to start a fund to help fund Palestinians in the boot camps. We haven't been able to talk about this because of time, but another thing that we do is something called Code for Palestine, which is driven by this idea of affecting curriculum and providing boot camps, and we actually do provide scholarships. You can learn more about it at, I'll put the website in, it's svpalestine.org, and you can read and follow up and can answer some questions that way. The second question was, how do we support skills and empower people, but also help solve problems in Palestine versus cater to the skill needs in other markets? I think it's interesting, and maybe I'll just open it up to the three of you to get your thoughts and perspective on that. Iliana, obviously you lived there for 2 years and spent lots of time in Gaza. Marwan, you've extremely connected and grew up there. But it would be great to just hear maybe the gaps that you see between global problem solving and Palestinian problem solving for what's most apparent. Anyone can take that.
Well, I can just give my 2 cents on that. Even though I didn't go to school in Palestine, I think that it's crazy to me that you test people on knowledge retention. It does not make any sense to me, and it's never made any sense to me when you have something like this in your hands. Why do I have to memorize and write down? And that's the higher education system, right? Tawjihi in Palestine, you'd have to memorize something for 6 months and then you forget about it the next day, right? We're not taught how to solve problems. I grew up in Jordan, so I can talk about Jordan. We're not taught about how to solve problems. They don't look at places like Africa, where you have, the African Leadership University. I think we need a Palestinian Leadership University because our biggest problem is bad leadership, right? We're not taught how to be leaders. We're taught how to be, pseudo doctors or something. I just think that's one of the biggest issues, is that we're teaching knowledge retention as opposed to problem solving.
And maybe, there's a lot we can unpack there. Unfortunately, we have time constraints. Maybe I'll just close by asking Seth, just from again, to zoom out again, where do you think this ecosystem goes from here? And what's the one critical thing that it needs to take place in order to maybe move it again for a step change?
Yeah, it's hard to pick just one, but one thing we have not talked about that I had a note that I wanted to make sure I said something about, which is kind of obvious, but it's money, right? And the reality is, startups require money, right, to get off the ground and to hire people and to develop. And I think that's one of the things that, funnily enough, we've actually studied this sort of thing. As I was writing my book, I came across there's actual research studies that show the obvious, which is that startups that have more money do better. But I think that it's really important to think about those systems that we're using to fund startups and how we can do a better job of not just educating people coming out of university. I think what Marwan just said is exactly right. We need to be educating leaders in Palestine. There's a huge leadership need. But also, how do we develop more local institutions? And so there's some work going on that front. Sadara did not end up, it was so early. It was it was nonprofit funded. It was Google.org. It was Soros Foundation, right? It was not necessarily kind of for profit, and they just couldn't get enough traction. They were actually in Yom Safra. It's unfortunate that they were just taking off when COVID hit. There is a venture fund that's now run out of the Bank of Palestine. It's affiliated with the Bank of Palestine, which is great. That's doing pretty well, and they're raising another fund, which is good. I don't have the solution here for this group, but I'd like smart people, myself included, to be thinking about how do we funnel more money into Palestine. And I'm watching this in other markets. I do a bunch of work in Africa as well, in markets in Africa, not the entire continent. And that has historically been a challenge there. And I'm watching more money come into those markets. One of the things that Marwan said, which is just, it's going to take a little bit of time, but I think it's going to really help, is having a successful outcome, right? I just think about what happened in the region generally with Kareem, right? And KSA specifically. One, a bunch of people made a bunch of money, and so they started putting it back into the ecosystem as angel investors, which is hugely impactful. But two, everyone started believing that you could build multi-billion-dollar businesses in the Middle East. And guess what? Now there's a bunch of multi-billion-dollar businesses in the Middle East and in KSA specifically. So some of that's going to come over time, but that's going to take some concerted effort and some people believing and putting dollars in, which is why I'm so happy that Stripe is investing in Manara as an example, because I'd love to get them in the next 5 things that we do there.
I'm being yelled at to close. I'm just going to wrap up. Sorry.
Marwan has something that he wanted to say,
yeah,
though.
We're
just going to go over it.
30 seconds.
Okay, so I'm going to say to Seth's point about money, Palestinians in the diaspora have money, right? That's the first resource that we go to, and that's what we're doing at GrowHome. We actually have a podcast where we bring on, we have 6 angel investors in the Palestinian diaspora. Palestinian startups pitch them. And I'll just say, to wrap up, so we're launching our beta in around 2 weeks. So if you're a Palestinian in the diaspora and you would like to get involved in the tech ecosystem, please either reach out to me on LinkedIn, go to growhome.app and listen to the podcast. And thank you all so much. This is amazing. I never thought I would be here at 20 years old, but I am.
So I want to close by maybe alluding to each of the things that you're working on. So for diaspora Palestinians, for folks who are in Palestine, growhome.app to get involved. For the folks who are interested in Manara, particularly the potential hiring partners, the details are in the chat, but you can go to manara.tech to find more information as well. And so anyone who has potential paths to hiring technical talent, this is an incredible resource, and obviously they're taking off. And then lastly, for folks who are looking or are interested in getting more involved in what we're doing more broadly support the development of Palestine's technology ecosystem, you can go to www.svpalestine.org or email info@svpalestine.org and sort of specify what you'd be interested in, whether it's entrepreneurship, startups, or whether it's something more on the technical side, and we'll follow up with you and plug you in. So wanted to thank everyone for joining. Thank you to our 3 wonderful panelists for providing all this color and context. I wish we had more time. There's a lot we could talk about, but thanks everyone, and thank you to the organizers for making this extremely seamless.
Thanks,
Thank
Adil.
you,
Great job.
everyone. Take care.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Have a great rest of your day.